really quickly. Hello, everyone. Thank you again for gathering. I love seeing all the little faces and all the waving that happens. Hello, everybody. Uh, we can't be together physically. Hopefully, we will be soon. In the interim, it's wonderful to be together digital in this way. And speaking of interims, I am the interim director here at San Francisco Camerawork. And one of the best parts of this interim job is that I get to be with all of you in this way, but I also get to meet some incredible artists, like the artist you're going to meet tonight. And one of the people at Camerawork who has helped introduce me to a lot of those artists is Erica Gentry, who is our head of programming here at San Francisco Camerawork, head of our programming committee. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Erica for our introductions, and we'll go ahead and get started for the evening. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks, Dave. Welcome, everybody. We're excited to have Priya join us. If you don't know anything about Priya Kambli, she's currently based in Missouri. So thank you for joining us and welcome to San Francisco. I get to say in a strange kind of world. But Priya originally was born in India and she moved to the United States at age 18, carrying her entire life in one suitcase that weighed about 20 pounds. That's not enough room for a camera, so it'll be interesting to hear her story. She began her artistic career in the US, and her work has always been informed by her experience as a migrant. One of her most significant accomplishments was receiving the book award through Photo Lucia's Critical Mass for her series, Color Falls Down. We'll provide that link so you can check out her book, and she will share a little bit of work from that series tonight. But it was this series that marked her maturing as an artist and was conceived shortly after she had her first child. Her son Kavi was born. Apparently now Kavi is 15 going on 30, you said, right? And this book inadvertently examines the questions asked by her son, then age 3. And he asked her, did she belong to two different worlds since she spoke two different languages? The essence of this question continues to be a driving force in her art making. Priya Kambli's artwork has been well received, having been exhibited, published, collected, and reviewed in the national and international photographic community. The success of her work underlines the fact that she is engaged in an important dialogue and reinforces her intent to make work driven by a growing awareness of the importance of many voices from diverse perspectives and the political relevance of our private struggles. She completed her BFA degree at the University of Louisiana in Lafayette and continued on to receive her master's at the University of Houston. Currently, she is a professor of art at Truman State University in Kirksville, Missouri. And I give to you Priya Kambli. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, SF Camerawork, for giving me the opportunity and platform to talk about my work. And welcome to my home in Kirksville, Missouri, from where I get to share my work to everybody who's watching. So I'm going to start sharing my screen and then I'll talk about my work. So I'm going to share screen. Here we go. Share. Okay. So can you guys see my screen? Okay. So today I'm going to talk about my work. I'll talk about my current body of work, Buttons for Eyes. But before I do that, I kind of want to give you some context to the work that I'm making. And today I'm going to start off with this image, which is not an image that I have made. It's an image made by my father. And the little child that is being held in the arms is me. And that's my sister standing by my feet. And that's my mother. And this image is really kind of pivotal to my work. The cutting of the face that you can see here is something that has been done by my mother. I remember her doing this. I'm about 4 years old, and I remember watching her cut multiple images and cut her face out of those multiple images. And once that was done, kind of slide them back into the family album, right? And I remember thinking that that's crazy, that she's crazy, that she's going to get into trouble for having done that. Because as I mentioned, these images are taken by my father, and he's sort of the image maker of the family. And he's creating this archive, which he doesn't know that yet, but he's making an archive which I will eventually use in my body of work. And she's slicing information out of it, you know, and putting it back. For me, the act of cutting this image and negating herself, of erasing herself from the information, and yet keeping me and my sister, preserving the image of me and my sister, and understanding in some way that the importance of a photograph, that she didn't rip it up, she didn't tear it up, she didn't harm the photograph, she harmed herself in the photograph, right? And in some way of erasing but preserving at the same time. And you can see this visual language of erasure, of obscuring that's happening with her kind of continue into my own art making. It becomes my visual language that I undertake, but it's coming from her. Whereas hers is much more sort of volatile, right? Mine isn't. Mine is very gentle, the obscuring, the erasing. It's very ornamentational. It's causes things to be much more beautiful. And it can be read as decorative, but it also does shift the narration of the photograph that I'm making. And so having said that, I'm going to jump into sort of my first sort of take on using family photographs. So in 2002, I created this body of work called the Suitcase series. And the conversations that started to happen with with this series continue to be conversations that are happening currently in my work. But with each year or each decade or each kind of climate that I go through, things are changing in my life, things are changing in my environment. I've become a mother twice over. I've become an American citizen. I've lived in America longer than I've lived in India. I'm hearing all these political uproars that are happening. So even though certain conversations are very much a part of the work, the climate around me shifts those conversations so they point in different directions in different phases in my life and in my work. So Erica mentioned I came here to United States with a suitcase, and this is what this body of work references. This is the first time I'm using my own personal narrative to talk about or to use that to create a body of work. When I came here at age 18, I came because it was sort of one of my choices to have a good life. And the reason is at age 15, my mother died from complications from breast cancer. And 6 months later, my father passed away from massive heart attack. And at that point, it was a pretty tumultuous life for me and my sister. But by the time I had turned 18, she was like 22, 21. She's 2 years older than me. And we were given a choice to come to States by my aunt, who's a physician here, and to live a life here. And so my sister and I both made choices that were sort of right for us at that moment in life. I decided to come here. She decided to stay in India. We knew that we were separating, and we knew we needed to kind of split our life, our inheritance that we had between us into two. And big part of the inheritance that we split were family photographs. And so when I came here at age 18, I brought with me family photographs in 2002, almost 10 years later, I started like slowly thinking about them and trying to figure out how to use them in my work. So this work has to do with the idea of a migrant narrative. How do you distill your life to fit the parameters of your suitcase? And how do these objects then, once unpacked, kind of create this whole life that you have left behind, or this assimilation of life that you have left behind, right? And so those questions are questions that are still part of my work right now. And then I started this body of work called Color Falls Down, for which Photolucida awarded me the book award. And with this body of work, I really started looking and thinking about these archive of images that I had, these family photographs. And the reason was very simple for looking at them, because it had been almost I came here at 18 and it's almost like I'm 30 at that point. So it's 12 years at that point. And it's 15 years since my parents have passed away. And I'm looking at them because my first child, Kavi, is born. And the loss and grief that I had felt at 15 sort of resurfaced. And the reason for it to resurface was very simple. I had something that I had created. I had stepped into a different form in my life, and I wanted them to be part of it. And there was just no way that they could, right? And so I started looking at these photographs and really thinking about how do I integrate them into my life so they become part of the next generation that's coming in, that is my child, right? And as Erica mentioned, Kavi's now 15. And at 15 years from now, I'm still looking at family photographs, but not with the intent of showing him off. He's 15 and the last thing he wants to do is be showed off or me to show him off. But I'm using them because there's some different intention in the work that's causing me to look and rethink them. And so with Color Falls Down, I'm also realizing that one of the things that's tying the two generations together is me. And so you'll see a lot of self-portraits in this work, kind of becoming that link that's chaining the two, connecting the two generations together. And it's a collage, it's a multiple of images. I'm using archival images that are my images that I brought with me when I'm 18. I'm using archival materials like jewelry that I've inherited and brought with me. So these are all the things that were sort of there in my suitcase, and some that are of my life now, right? So it's always about the past, but it's always looking at the present, also looking at the future. Trying to spoon feed him culture, Indian culture. He was just like, no way, that's your baggage, not mine. And so I'm moving on to the next series that happened after Kitchen Gods, which is after Color Falls Down, which is Kitchen Gods. Here I'm doing something that I intended to when I started Color Falls Down, which is to really look and think about the family photographs I had with me. But what happened was I had so many conversations in my head that it was impossible to kind of distill it down to one conversation. There was too much going on in my life. I was a new mother and everything was kind of fascinating and frightening and amazing and petrifying, So there were lots of things to think about. And so there was just no way to kind of distill anything down to its essence. And so Color Falls Down has all these conversations about shifting cultural identity, kind of living in the States longer at some point than I've lived in India, all kinds of conversations and plays into happening. But with Kitchen Gods, I'm really looking at images that are happening in studios in India. Again, this is of my family. So talking and thinking about portraiture and how the idea of identity is constructed and how with studio portraiture, we're so aware of that construction. And again, I'm using sort of my mother's mark making and kind of using materials in a way to kind of alter and shift sort of conversations. I'm aware I'm using images that are appropriated, even though they're mine. I claim them as mine because they are mine technically. I haven't photographed them. I'm aware that that identity belongs to somebody else. It's not mine. And so I know that these images have somebody else's intent, thoughts, desires, lives embedded in them. What I'm trying to do is sort of shift those conversations so that I can have the conversations that I want to have through this work. And I will talk about material use and sort of use of the archival material a lot more when it comes to Button for Eyes. This is just a preview to kind of get you to kind of see where I've landed with Buttons for Eyes and kind of give you a trajectory of the work per se. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. Please feel free to ask me questions about them as they come up. This is my father at, I don't know, 6 or 7. I was watching Sesame Street with my daughter and they were showing us how to make rainbows. And I was like, I'm going to make a rainbow on the photograph. These are my grandparents. And then I have, you will also see that there's a lot of physicality involved in the work in the sense of the tactileness. I work on them, I work on the original photographs, and there's a lot of sort of information that is kind of layered on top. And here I'm working again with the photograph of my father, the 5 decades that he was alive, starting from his 10s, 20s, 30s, 40s, and his 50s. And what I'm doing is pricking one hole at a time so that this image or this pattern appears on them. And then I've also realized that every time I go to India, at some point or the other, I inherit more photographs. So this series is Mami, which actually means uncle's wife. So this is my mother's brother's wife. And they didn't have any children. So when they both passed away, their photographs were sort of my sister and my inheritance. But my sister didn't want any of it. For her, it was a burden. It was a burden to have these photographs because she didn't know what to do with them. And they were going to stay in some corner in her house or in some box in her house. And so for her, it was sort of a relief that I wanted it, that I desperately needed to have them. But once I have them, I was like, what am I going to do with them? And I started thinking about this idea of what happens to a photograph when the life of the image of the person, of the subject expires, right? Does the life of the photograph expire too? Means they were wanted, desired, and coveted at some point. And how do I make them wanted, desired, and coveted again? And so I'm working on the photographs themselves. They become like a little jewel-like objects. These holes let lights in, and you can kind of see them like kind of light up when they are lit. And so this is another body of work, Shubhamangala Savidhan. And here I'm realizing that I've worked with my archive for about 10 years or so. And I'm still working with the archive, and I'm kind of curious about my intention of kind of going back and looking through my archive of photographs again and again and using them in my body of work. As I said before, when I started working, the intention was to have a conversation or a relationship with the people in the photographs. And at some point I realized that I actually had a longer relationship with the archive of images than I did with the people in the photograph, you know? And so what I realized at some point is that I was interested in the people, but I was also interested in the photographic archive itself and what it meant to have an archive and what it meant for me as a visual artist to take that information and to kind of recontextualize it to have conversations that I needed to have.
Priya, we have a question. Do you mind answering the question? Sorry.
No, not at all.
To interrupt you. There were some questions about the patterning that you're doing over the top, and also the materials that you're using. I bet you get a lot of questions about materials, which is probably a little unnerving, but because we can't see them in person, if you could tell us about your choice of patterning and some of the materials that you're using, that would be great.
Yeah, I will. I was going to keep it for buttons for eyes, but I'll start now. So the patterning is coming from textiles. I love clothes. Those of you who know me, you've seen me put as many patterns on myself as possible. And one of the things that's really easy to travel, when I travel to collect, is textiles. India is also a very vibrant culture, and for some reason, having grown up there, it's kind of stuck in my brain. So the patterns that you're seeing are actually coming from textiles. What I'll do is I'll pick up a motif from it, and then I'll create my own patterns with it. And then I put the patterns onto the photographs. The materials that I'm using, I'll just go back to Kitchen Gods, are really simple, very humble. These are flower petals, rice, and rice flour. So these are some of the big things that you will see again and again in my work. The rice flour, the flower petals, and sort of everything that is the material choice are very domestic, very humble, very everyday. There's sort of these, I call them my kitchen gods. So they're my sort of everyday gods, my people to blame for everything and to ask for anything, you know. And so my offering for them comes from my kitchen, you know. And so anything and everything that's in the kitchen becomes kosher for play in my studio. And as you can see, the kitchen is back there, and this is my studio. This is my dining room table, my dining room, and this is my studio. So there's a big interconnection between the spaces, but also connection in sort of the Indian lives of the women offering the ancestors sort of meals and everything coming for the offerings from the kitchen. So the domestic choice nature is also a very kind of premeditated choice. Sort of these humble offerings, I want them to be as humble, but I want them also to be something that sustain and nourish us. To be used. And of course, I'm using them in a way that elevates them from their usual everyday mundaneness or domesticness, you know. Is that good? I'll come back to it more again. And so here you'll see again, I'm using flour. And you know, the reason I showed you the image of my mother, and you can see that obscuring is a big part of my language or my visual language. I obscure so that I talked about how these images are not mine, they're appropriated images. So they're already embedded with conversations of their past. And if I want them to have conversations that are about me and my present, then I need to kind of in some way kind of alter them. And the alteration that my mother did is too tumultuous for me. And I'm really not interested in harming these images or this archive in any shape or form, but I am very curious to see how I can alter them. And so this is flour that's on a surface of the photograph, and the pattern that's happening is an interleaving that is in the wedding album. And the interleaving has an embossed pattern on it, and flour is so fantastic. If you like smush it down and just even put your fingerprint or something in it, it'll leave an impression. And so the impression is of that interleaving in the family, in the wedding album. There we go. And so, you know, and I'm making sure there's no alterations that happening photographically. All the alterations are happening manually in terms of using flour. I'm trying to keep some opacity so you can see sometimes some transparency, some opaqueness, so you can see or not see information depending on what I want the viewer to see or not see. Shubha Mangala Savadan is a really interesting mantra. It's sort of announced right when the wedding happens. It also says, caution, the auspicious moment is here, or that's what it means. And so I love sort of this interplay of play that's happening in here and that's happening in this work itself. And people always ask me the choice of white here and if it has to do with the wedding. And really, truly, Indian weddings are so potent and colorful that metaphor doesn't hold through. The flower definitely holds through because it allows me to imprint information that I want. But flour also comes because my father was a baker, a French pastry chef. Anomaly in India, frankly, but also comes from Rangoli drawings that you make little drawings on your threshold to kind of welcome an auspicious moment or auspicious day. And at the beginning of the day, they're beautiful, they're wonderful, they're perfect. And at the end of the day, with people going in and out of your threshold, they fall apart, right? And so I love the flower, the ability of it to take an imprint and then the ability of it to you know, go back to its own makeup and its own origin over time, you know, again.
Priya, some folks in the chats are talking about the performative nature of the work, and not everybody understands that you're photographing after you've assembled the image, and that's the final product. Is that right?
Yeah. So I get asked that a lot. If you haven't seen them in real life, like what is the actual object? And the actual object is the photograph. And the reason the actual object is the photograph is the light. So when you look at these images, they have flower on it. They aren't as stunning. They're pretty flat, frankly, because when you're just holding them, in order to see the pattern, it's so subtle, you kind of have to like shift it around with the light to kind of see it. And so the light is actually what makes that pattern appear. Otherwise, it's so subtle, you wouldn't necessarily like see it. You kind of have to pay attention to it. And so for me, light is sort of really essential. I know as a photographer, it's kind of silly to say light is essential because it's, what a photograph is a record of light. But for me, I make these ephemeral things that I photograph, but the life that they have is because the light in them, and with each body of work, the light is very specific. I work with natural light. All my objects are constructed in my studio. So I have a lot of sort of way of sort of controlling them. So with the light, with it being natural, I have to let go of certain control. I have to let go of certain sort of my biases or my preoccupations, right? And every body of work has a different light you can see in it that comes into play. And so we'll start with buttons for eyes. And here, just as I mentioned before, the conversations of using archival material is still present. The question of family is still present. Question of cultural identity is present. But there's also a conversation that's coming into play, which is a very recent conversation that we're all starting to hear. But as an immigrant, it becomes really problematic. And I'm sure it's problematic for anybody who cares, which is the anti-immigrant rhetoric that we've been hearing quite a bit, right? And it's been really kind of, challenging to hear this rhetoric and to kind of think about the work. One of the things that's been really interesting about having somebody write about the work is recently for Kitchen Gods, Jodie Throckmorton wrote about my work, and it was really lovely for her to have her essay in my life, because one of the things that she did was sort of gave me a platform, which I kind of knew I had, but I hadn't quite, taken it, which is this sort of migrant platform. I've always thought of my work as a very sort of domestic, very sort of personal, sort of very intuitive in certain ways, but very kind of about my own storytelling. And she talks about how in this sort of era of anti-immigrant rhetoric, it's really important to hear personal narratives, because what we're doing is we're dehumanizing by these anti-immigrant rhetorics, and what these personal storytelling does is sort of humanize. And so the personal is political, like this mantra, this feminist mantra, is something that's really kind of essential. And so that conversation, or those conversations that she brought to the table, have been really kind of fundamentally important and essential for me to kind of think and talk about my work. And so here you can see there's a little bit of a shift happening. The light is very potent in this body of work. I'm still using archives, but I'm using photographs that are taken by my father, photographs that are not studio made, photographs that are not from the family wedding album, but photographs that he has actually made. He was an amateur photographer who took photography very seriously, and it created this amazing archive that I've been tapping into and working and playing with. I'm gonna just stay here for a second on this body of this image, because I'm going to end with a series that I'm making in here in COVID, and these silver objects that you see will come back into play. So just kind of keep them in mind. And so here we have flower again, a portrait of it, right? Because it's so pertinent and important in my work. But you can kind of see here that the light, again, is like this really intense light. I'm photographing this body of work between like, whenever the light is leaving, right when the light leaves, it's just this potent light. And within the 15 minutes or so, I'm photographing it. I'm like making these images, waiting for the light to be what I need it to be. So for a long time, I'll make these images. They sit on my sit wherever they sit, you know, in my house. And sometimes they just fall apart waiting, you know, because the light is not right. And then I have to remake it when the light happens. Or they fall apart and the light is perfect and I can't go photograph them because they have fallen apart. It's this flower, it does not stay, you know, it does not hold itself. It has these wonderful cracks that happen in it and they fall apart. And you can also see that my kids, my children are coming into play. My daughter, who's 9 years old now, she's been coming into play. She's sort of, you know, I started off with Color Falls Down, where I'm sort of my body or me, I'm part of the work. And she's sort of becoming my substitute in the work. Basically because she's a fabulous substitute, and it's really hard to be in front and behind the camera simultaneously. My husband is a painter, and so I thought initially this would be easy. He would be my sort of assistant, and it turns out that painters are not photographers. You know? They don't know how to make a photograph. They don't know how to frame. They don't know how to focus. Apparently, that has eluded them. I'm just kidding. And so it's really interesting to have her kind of be sort of sit in for lieu of me. And so the work is starting to kind of become not necessarily political, but kind of talk about these conversations that are in my everyday. So the work is about sort of similar things, but kind of how the political climate, my everyday, affects it and changes it, right? And just to kind of talk about, all my series have these very particular names, and you can feel free to ask me about them, but I'll talk about Buttons for Eyes. So Buttons for Eyes comes from my mother asking me when I was little if I had eyes or buttons for eyes. Every time she asked me to find something and I couldn't. And so Buttons for Eyes comes from this idea of like not necessarily me not being able to find certain things, but this nuanced idea of, you know, how we as a collective kind of need to really observe, kind of really need to focus, kind of really need to see what's happening in our own surroundings and really think and talk and kind of be proactive about it. My computer, okay, there we go. So I'm just gonna scroll through these images. And this is my son coming into play. People always ask me, what will happen to you when you archive? Because I use images from my archive once my archive is dwindled. And I always say, I'll just make some other body of work, right? And so this is also me understanding that at some point the archive will dwindle, but also at some point the archive won't allow me to have the conversations I want to have. And so more and more of these other imageries are coming into play also. But also with Buttons for Eyes, there's sort of a playfulness that's always been part of my work, but there's also so much control that's exerted in the work that sometimes the play becomes, it's not always available for the audience. So with Buttons for Eyes, I'm really trying to make sure that the play is sort of essential and at the surface in terms of color, in terms of sort of patterning, or in terms of light, however that is needs to be. I'm always trying to imprint my kids apparently with my culture, like literally physically imprinted on them. And you can also see there's a lot of labor sort of involved in creating these images. And labor is a big part of this work. My work is very studio based. It's very sort of internal. I work inside my home. I don't actually ever leave my house to make work. And so in some ways, that labor becomes really sort of crucial in the image making. I feel like in some ways, if I'm not leaving the house, then how am I sort of claiming to be this image maker or this photographer when my world is so limited and so small, right? And so my way of sort of kind of taking those things into account is like really intensely working to create this image that while I'm working on it sometimes falls apart, and creating it. And so that when this photographed, you're seeing the labor, but you're also sort of not aware of it in certain ways, because it kind of becomes its own, and it takes its own presence. This is just a spoonful of sugar. Every time I leave India, they always put something sweet in my mouth. The idea is that you will remember the departing is sweet, so that you're not sad about leaving, but also that you remember, like, looking back on things with sweetness, I guess. This is rice on the photograph. This is a letter that I wrote to my father. One side it's my writing, whoops, and on the other side is my sister's. I'm apparently trying to write in English and not succeeding, so I start my first sentence, have a hard time, and then I go back to the language I grew up in. And on the other side, my sister is basically saying, whatever I've written is total bullshit. And so when I first made this image, I was just like, I'm gonna just erase everything she's written. And it's so funny because nobody else would know unless you understood Marathi and could read it. But my first instinct was to kind of cover everything she said, because I was like, I can do this. This is my archive, right? And so it's like payback. And then I realized she's right. It's kind of bullshit, what everything I've written. And so I'm erasing mine, but I love the idea of I am working hard, because I am. The two of us. So there's also a lot of archival material that I have, and it's kind of really interesting to see some of sort of really weird little things that happen. As I mentioned, my father was a French pastry chef. His training is actually in the US. He ran away when he was 30 years old, and nobody knew where he went. He apparently came to States. We don't know how. And he trained here as a pastry chef, and this is from Chicago, but he actually trained in Kansas City, which is like 3 hours from where I am at this point. So it's really weird and bizarre for me to kind of see and think about these sort of connections that randomly and weirdly happen. Like, Midwest was never a part of my conversation in any part of my life, but the fact that I was offered a job ended up bringing me here. But Midwest was already sort of in my life in a way that I didn't even know. And going through this archive, the narratives and storytelling that's happening. I love this little plaque, Kambli Bros. So this is my grandparents' house. It's this little tiny little house apartment. I think it's like, I can't remember how many square feet, between 500, 600 square feet, I think. And 11 people used to live there, you know, and now it's just one person, but the plaque is still there. It says Kambli Brothers. Both my grandfather and his brother used to live there. So I'm going to quickly go through this, just so I have a few minutes to talk about my latest series, which is happening in COVID, which is called Devara. Devara basically means a little house for gods. And so these are the little gods in my Devara. And these are gods that I've inherited, just like my photographs. This is my archive that's coming from my mother, which for me is fascinating because I've been working with the archive that I've inherited mostly from my father in terms of the photographs. And now I'm working with this archive that I've inherited, which is this little set of gods, or her collection of gods that I have, and sort of making images with them. And so this is what I've been doing since March 12th, which is when we went into lockdown, basically. And what I'm doing is making cyanotypes with them. The objects that you're seeing are objects that are here. Of course, they don't represent themselves as they are anymore, because if you've made a cyanotype, the way it works is that you take a piece of paper, put emulsion on it, and put your objects on top. So the imprints that are left by the objects are really truly what we're seeing here. And I love this idea of like taking this material, taking this information and using them, and in some ways, again, erasing identity and kind of playing with them in some ways. I've also been really interested, for me, it's always been interesting being sort of from the East, making work in the West, being educated in the West. People always ask me, and when they look at my everyday objects and read them as exotic, right? So for me, it's always been this conversation about, when I show my everyday objects, how do I make them realize, how do I make the viewer realize that they are everyday? And even though they might read as exotic because they don't look like everyday objects from here, they are everyday. And so cyanotypes have been this fantastic way of sort of negating those conversations, of taking the exoticism out of it. And what we're left with is these little simple, basic shapes. And it was really interesting because March 12th, before the lockdown happened, I was in Houston for PhotoFest and SPE. And so there were these wonderful conversations that I was having with a lot of photographic peers, and seeing work and kind of being really inspired. This body of work, Devara, is something that I've been thinking for almost 2 years. Most of my work is really slow. I think about it for a long time before I make work. It kind of has to like coalesce in my head. I have to kind of know what I'm doing before I make work. And so for 2 years, I've been thinking about how to make this work. And I really didn't want to photograph them. I knew that if I photographed them, that we wouldn't be talking about the humble, everyday sort of artifacts. We would be talking about how exotic and how gorgeous they were. And so I kind of wanted them to distill them down in a way that I could put in my suitcase, if I can say, you know, kind of put it back to kind of the basic way of looking and thinking of things. And so when the lockdown happened, I knew that I had cyanotypes at home, and I knew I had these objects. And so I started just putting them on top of these and kind of seeing what happens to them. And over time, this is sort of the evolution that you're seeing of them. Once in a while, it doesn't want to scroll. And so what you're seeing is me putting the objects on the cyanotype and then moving them around, bringing them back in, moving them around again, putting them back out in the sun. So so I'm breaking the shapes down even more and more, so they become much more abstracter in some ways, rather than sort of keeping their original sort of intent. And also there's sort of lots of layers to this body of work that's going to come into play. But one of the things that the Devara always gets offered is flowers. And so you can see that flowers and materials like that have always been in the body of work, patterns that have always been in the body of work, kind of coming into play in a very different way. And I think the last slide here is the last one I have. And then I'm working on an installation right now that's going to be, these are 18 by 24 each. And so I'm halfway through. So this is going to be a big installation with 18 pieces in play. But it takes me about a day to make one of these. They take about 6 hours to make, basically because they're not sitting quietly anywhere. I put objects on them, I put them out in the sun. Depending on how the light is, 30-40 minutes later, they come back in, I shift things around, I move things around, they go back outside, they come back in after 30-40 minutes, then they go back outside. They do this about 6 or 7 times in the day. And so I usually have to start right at like 10 o'clock or so when the UV light is good and strong. And I'm usually done by like 3 or 4 sometimes, when the light is kind of shifting in, kind of moving away. Again, natural light is something that's a big part of this work. Again, patterning is a big part of work. Again, erasure is a big part of work. Again, using the archive is a big part of this work, right? So all these conversations that have been started from the get-go are part of this work. But again, something else is in play in my life, which is COVID. And unfortunately, it's just not my life, it's everybody's life, right? And so with that in mind, like, what does the work then do? How do I have the conversations that I need to have and want to have in my work? How do I make them happen? And this is my sort of way of having them. I can take any questions. This is my last slide.
Yes, Carrie Orvik has a question. She first says, such beautiful work. Did you ever have a conversation with your mother about why she cut her face from the photos?
So, like I mentioned, my mother passed away when I was 15. You know, I saw this act when I was like 4 or 5, and she's kind of did this for a little bit of time, and then she didn't do it anymore. And so we just didn't talk about it. Like, it just kind of was something that happened, and then it didn't happen for a while. And, you know, as a child, I had other things on my mind, and I was growing up, I was going away from her, and I didn't necessarily want to know. I was kind of creating my own identity. And by the time I wanted those questions answered, she wasn't around to answer them. I remember talking with my aunt, her sister, who's, as I mentioned, she's a pediatrician, she's a physician. And even she was so startled on seeing these, you know, on seeing this image of that she had cut out, you know, and it's a very jagged edge that's cut out. It's a very kind of potent, you know, when you run your fingers through it, it's like so pokey. And so there are conversations I couldn't have with her. I think it's very easy to assume it might be vanity, but I think there's a lot more deeper things that I'm not sure I can understand. And that's why those sort of volatile marks are not repeated in my work. Instead, there's sort of, in my work, I go the opposite direction. You know, they're very gentle, they're very seductive, they're very sort of, you know, they're about beautification, there's about ornamentations, they're about sort of, I don't know, desire, safety, softness, you know, everything that her mark isn't about.
Thank you. Was it difficult for you to move away from working with images of the figure?
So it's been really interesting to make the cyanotypes because it's very different from the way I work. It's not at all representational. It's a very abstract. But you can see that the conversations that it's not that far away from the way I've been working. You know, I've been working with that way on top of a photograph, on top of a body. Sometimes I put, you know, flower on my child, you know. So patterning is something that I'm constantly doing. But this time I'm working not with a photograph underneath it and kind of really going in an abstract route. So yeah, it's very, it's odd, it's different, but it's also very exciting in some ways because it gives me a lot more freedom. I have, you know, like while I'm stuck at home here, I'm making work. I'm kind of keeping my sanity together. As I mentioned, you know, I have a 15-year-old in this house. Those of you who have a teenager, you know, like there are lots of crises having a young child of that age in your house, you know, so there's a lot of disruption, not just from COVID, but like for COVID related reasons that are being exacerbated, right? And so I needed some way to kind of mentally kind of disengage from every day. And so this allows me to do that. And for some reason, you know, with Buttons for Eyes, I hadn't made any work since last year. And so something had kind of stopped me from picking up my camera anyway. So it wasn't like, I kind of felt like I needed to do something, move in a different direction. I needed to kind of challenge myself, make work, think about things differently, just shift. You know, I needed some kind of change in my life. And I didn't know what it was. And COVID kind of triggered by giving me the time and by being so tumultuous, like pushing me into out of my safety zone, that I probably would have taken 2 years, more years to kind of eke myself out of, you know? So yes, it's different, but it's also coming from a methodology that's already in play.
Thank you. Jackie Roop also has a question for you. She's based down in Carmel. And she wanted to know about your earlier series. I think it was the one that you showed before Buttons for Eyes, some of the coloration, the rainbow effects on the images in the middle, and almost like a refraction of light. She found them really enticing and interesting and wanted to know more about why you chose that particular treatment.
So for some reason, for my 40th birthday, I wanted a prism. You know, that's what I wanted from my husband. And so, like the academics we are, he asked the physicist here, like, what is the best prism to have? And he got me that, you know. And so I had this prism, and lo and behold, I couldn't figure out how to use it. I know it's as simple as you let a light go through it and it shines, you know. I'm like, it didn't work for me. It didn't do, I had all these dreams about a prism and what it was going to do, and it did nothing. You know, it did absolutely nothing. So I was just kind of bummed. And then I think that was almost a year, 2 years later, I was on sabbatical and I was playing again with Buttons for Eyes. And the color in that work was so saturated that I felt like it was time to bring that prism out and see what it does. And I had enough time, because being on sabbatical, to kind of really just kind of play, because the prism will, you know, the light goes through it and it brings out a rainbow, but I didn't know what to do with that, you know. And it gave me enough time to kind of like really kind of just put any kind of material in it, kind of watch, observe. A lot of my work comes from just kind of really just looking and observing. Like I mentioned, I photograph in my house. All the images are made in my house. So most of the days I'm just sitting in some corner and watching the light shift and change in my house with the passing of days, passing of weather. Everything shifts, everything changes, light comes in differently, light comes in from a different angle. You know, all those sort of everyday nuances I had in the sabbatical, just time to look and think. And just having that time allowed me to kind of figure out how to use it so that it was having the conversations I thought it could have when I wanted it, you know. So it took me a while to figure it out. But yeah, the prism is what I'm using, and I kind of am like using it as also as a connection, because I sometimes have multiple images strung together, so the light is bouncing from one image to the other as it moves through. And I like that connection of it too.
We have a question from Meg Schiffler. So I'll go ahead. I assume she wants to ask in person. Oh. Meg, you're on. Sometimes people ask, oh, there she is. Hi.
Hi.
Did you have a question for Priya? Oh, I guess.
No, you can't. I can't hear you.
Can't hear you, no. That's okay. While you're fixing that, we're going to move on to Vikesh Kapoor. She says, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. As both an artist and an educator, how do you feel you're contributing to the voices of Asian and Asian American artists in America? And what do you hope to see in the coming years?
Well, as, you know, as an educator, I feel like one of the things that as an educator of color, I feel and as a woman artist who's of color, I feel I bring, I need to bring something to my classroom which is different from maybe my other peers. And we're always looking at artists of color in the work, in my classroom, always, and always looking at women artists too. I feel that is really essential. And so I feel like, and I'm teaching in rural Midwest, so usually the only person of color in my classroom is me, you know, and I have a predominantly white Caucasian population that's in my classroom. So I have to make them understand that the world doesn't revolve around them. You know, I have to make them understand that there's so many other conversations that are happening, and just because we are not privy to it, or they're not privy to it yet, doesn't mean they can't be privy to it now, or they can't participate in it now. This is the time for us to kind of open up our boundaries, kind of make them porous, allow all these sorts of conversations to come into play. And so we're looking at a wide range of artists. And really looking and thinking about the work that's happening in the context of the political context that it's happening, and really thinking about how do we take something that is kind of new to us, and how do we take those conversations and those, so that sort of imprint, and how do we kind of decode it and kind of understand it, you know, how do we make it so that it's no longer the other to us, but something that we have to do is sort of understand that we have to step outside our own comfort zone and kind of step into somebody else's and use their language to help us understand how we talk and how we have conversations about those things.
Wonderful, thank you. There's lots of other questions.
Such a big question.
we can stay, if you can stay a little later, we can stay and continue the Q&A. But let's see, there's a question from Parul, who was a former student of mine, and she's asking, she says, it's so interesting to see that your mother, your mom's objects that were a part of her daily life, but you're using them in your images. You seem to have a strong connection to her. What are the differences she sees between your generation and your mother's generation? And she says, Priya and I share so much culturally, and languages also. If you can share your thoughts about the generational differences.
Yeah, so one of the things that I have to sort of admit is that, you know, I've been out of India for a long time. You know, my idea of India is no longer India anymore. You know, that the culture has shifted, the culture has changed. My sister is there, and you know, I feel like I'm kind of, I don't know it enough anymore. I'm not a part of it enough anymore to understand. But I see my nieces, and they have freedom that I didn't have, and I'm so excited and I'm so glad for them. You know, they're making choices, they're taking risks that were sort of, you know, shunned when I was there. And so I don't think I'm the right person to have those conversations about. My computer, for whatever reason, just crashed.
That happens.
Oh, it happens. Thank you so much for calling back. We'll fix this all in post.
We have one final question, and then we'll let you go.
Okay.
Final question, Meg.
Yeah.
Hi, Priya. This is Meg. And I thought it was very interesting when you described your work as gentle, as opposed to your mom's cutout, which was very maybe aggressive. And that's really interesting, because when I view your work, and when I viewed it before, I actually find it pretty aggressive and almost violent, because you're actually,
Do you?
Yeah, because you're actually puncturing with a pin, and then you're covering images in this way that you're covering the face a lot of times, or covering the body, and creating these sort of rigid holes in which the viewer looks at the subject, or the subject is looking out at the viewer. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about gentleness as opposed to aggressiveness, because when you showed your mom's photos, I was like, ah, I was right. And then you used these words that were very different at the end. And so my perception of your work really jives with what your mom did.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so I think for me, for the violence that's in her work, in terms of like literally like sticking, you know, sticking a, like, I don't know what, knife through the photograph or scissors through it and puncturing a hole in it, for me is very, very sort of harsh, you know, something that's very alien to me. Like, I don't think I could ever see myself doing that. I think of my patterning as obscuring. Definitely that language is coming from that, but that patterning is sort of, you know, it's for me, in comparison to her violence, it's very sort of soft in regard to that. And the materials that I'm using to cover are very soft, very domestic. When they're laid on top, they sort of, you know, let me sort of change and shift them the way I want to. And also that I can erase that information once I've photographed it. So it's not a permanent in any way, shape, or form. So for me, maybe gentle might be overkill in that sense of way, but I don't think of them as violent because it's not permanent. You know, it's a temporary mark that I'm making. It's a temporary obscuring that's happening. And that it will, in some ways, once I am done with the mark that I have made and I've photographed it, that I will be able to have the photograph go back to its original state, that we have had this sort of conversation with each other, we have talked with each other, we've looked and exchanged whatever we needed to exchange with each other, and then we both go back to our own situ, you know, and we're kind of back to our own origin. Versus with her marks, I feel like, you know, that it can't go back to its original makeup. It's completely been shifted and changed. So I think that's where my idea of separation of her mark making and my mark making comes from.
Great. Thank you so much, Priya. We really appreciate you staying up late for us. And there's lots of rounds of applause from your friends and your new friends.
Thank you.
I'm going to give it back to Christina because we, as you know, San Francisco Camerawork is a nonprofit member-based organization. You can support us by joining as a member on our website, sfcamerawork.org. And we also are having another artist talk tomorrow. I hope everybody can join us for work by Rodrigo Valenzuela. I want to make sure I've met him in LA and saw his work at a show. He if I'm not incorrect, he's also a professor at UCLA. A very interesting work, very interesting artist. I hope everybody can join us tomorrow. And I'm going to hand it back over to Dave or Christina, whoever would like to take us out. Thank you.
I think that was it. Thank you so much for sharing your work, Priya. Thank you, Erica, for moderating and taking us through the questions. Thank you, Meg, for getting your camera and appearing. That's always great when people join us. Thank you, Christina, as always, for making these things come together. I saw our board members, Philip Sager and our board president, Michelle Branch, in the house. Thank you for being here. Lots of wonderful friends from the community. I see a lot of names that have appeared in these panels with us or on talks with us before. It's wonderful to see all of you coming back. And as Erica said, I hope to see you all here again tomorrow. So thank you, everyone, and we will see you soon.